Welcome to Geek Philosophy, where we love geeky wisdom. If you're new to the channel, my name's Brian, and today we're going to be discussing a few different ways that you can play your favorite tabletop role-playing game. Specifically, either using the theater of the mind or using a battle map or virtual tabletop. So first, what I thought would be really helpful is to define what we mean when we say theater of the mind, or at least what I have in mind when I say that. It's really a style of storytelling that was popular in the 1930s and 40s in radio dramas, believe it or not. This is where voice actors and sound effects and music were all combined to create the illusion of a stage play in the listener's mind. And they would listen to this on the radio as the story unfolds. But with podcasts, you can actually see, or rather hear this again today, and they've become pretty popular again. But for D&D and other tabletop role-playing games, theater of the mind really refers to when you use your imagination to visualize the game world and all of the actions that are taking place within it. Now, in most tabletop role-playing games, the GM describes the scene, the players describe the character's actions, and then everybody uses their own imagination to create a mental picture in their mind of what's happening. And it can vary from player to player. Actually, it has to, because it's your own unique mental picture. And how we communicate is making sure that we have at least a baseline understanding of what's going on, even though we're inventing the story in our own mind. So you can imagine this approach allows for a little bit more freedom of creativity. As players are actively forming these scenes in their mind, you can create more and you can think, oh, I can do this instead, or this is what it looks like. That may seem daunting to a game master or a dungeon master. You may be new to this and want a little bit of help to paint a better picture for your players. And as before in the channel, I recommend checking out dScryb, which I actually use this. I'm not just recommending it because you get a discount using my link or code in the description below, but also because I actually use this tool. dScryb offers thousands of searchable descriptions of places and monsters and spells and a bunch of other stuff for the game. And there's free stuff that you can get there too, but if you go with a subscription model, you get a lot more. And the descriptions are designed to be read aloud, almost like if you were speaking a radio drama. Speaking of radio drama, they also now have sound effects and music and ambient sound that you can work into your game too. And a cartographer section of maps that are included so you can use those in your game. Speaking of maps, the battle map approach to role-playing games has been there since the beginning, really. It was part of the original creation of Dungeons & Dragons back in the 70s. And when you went from commanding an army in a war game down to commanding a single character, it was an easy transition to use the mini for your character and a battle map that was the dungeon or whatever else was going on in that crazy imagination of the game master. By definition, this approach uses miniatures and terrain pieces to represent the game world. And it allows you to be more tactical because you have physical pieces to represent the characters and the environment, so everybody literally can see what's happening, or at least a representation, and get the same idea instantly. You're not counting on everybody's interpretation inside their own brain. You've got something to interpret the whole landscape, so to speak, of what's happening right there at your table. So players can make, easy tactical decisions based on this, and it allows for more accurate representation of distances and line of sight and all that kind of stuff if it's important for your type of gameplay. In recent years, virtual tabletops, or VTTs, have become an alternative to using physical battle maps, which is great when we had to social distance and we had to play online, or if you just want to play with people across the world. So a virtual tabletop is a digital tool that simulates that physical tabletop with the minis and the terrain pieces and things like that, but it allows you to connect online with a digital representation of everything that you would have at the table. So the GM and the players can actually move these virtual miniatures or tokens around the map, and they can roll virtual dice, and you can use all of those things that you would represent physically at the table inside these virtual tabletops. Now, okay, so just my 2 copper pieces, but if you feel pressured to subscribe to the biggest, best, newest, or even currently in development official virtual tabletop to play with your friends, you don't really need it. The way I use virtual tabletops doesn't really call for anything too complex anyway. Now, you might want all that stuff, but I just need it to show what the basic terrain is of the area and where all of the combatants are for combat, and be able to move things around as we talk things through. You could use something like Owlbear Rodeo. It's actually a really great tool. It's easy, it's streamlined, and it gets the job done really well. But I've also just used a shared Google slide, like a presentation, and it worked well for a virtual tabletop. You can use squares or import images to it, and everybody can share that document and move things around. And now there are actually even virtual and free whiteboards that might work better for you. A whiteboard like where you can write things or draw things or plan things out for meetings and stuff. Well, think about your game. If you can write things or draw things or drop images and objects on a whiteboard, everybody has access to it and move things around. You can make it a virtual tabletop, especially if it supports putting images in. You could put an image file of a map and then have other things representing your character tokens and or different parts of the battlefield. It's actually pretty straightforward. It doesn't do all the rules integration and rolling of dice and things like that, but do you really need it for a virtual tabletop? Maybe you do, if that's the kind of game that you like to play, but by and large, if you're just playing the game like you would at the table you have your books and your dice and your pens and your paper, so you just need something to represent the spot of where the combat goes. So you don't really need all that stuff. But I am not downing all that stuff. If you like that and it's useful for you, you should use it. It's really up to you as a GM and your players to decide, what do you like best? What's the most useful for your game? It's also up to the GM and all the players to decide which one of these approaches you prefer. If you want to use your imagination and have greater control of the creative freedom, you may want to use theater of the mind, and you're not locked into what this character looks like on the table already painted up. But if you prefer a more tactical and tactile visual approach, you might want a battle map or a virtual tabletop. I think most GMs and players use both methods to some degree, and they kind of split and switch between both a map and, theater of the mind. And usually it's the map for combat and theater of the mind for everything else, because it's really hard to make a map and mini to have a social interaction really be, efficient and make sense for the game. And this blend can really add to the level of immersion and realism in the game, because the players can see the layout of the battlefield, they can better visualize all the tactical combat, but then they're not worried about that when they switch over and they're doing more of a social or exploration type roleplay. One of my favorite methods that I picked up right here on YouTube is the ultimate dungeon terrain concept made famous by Professor Dungeon Master. Think of it as a circular theater stage that you adjust as the scenes change. Circular so you can spin it and everybody can see it from all angles. And you can even put it on a cheap turntable to make it easy to turn around for everybody to see. And you can move minis and terrains on and off of this little stage to represent what's going on at that particular time, and even explain how things progress by they go into a room and this happens, and then they move to the next room, clear things off, put it back in place with other bits of terrain. It's really it's better explained by Professor Dungeon Master, because he will show you how to make one and how he uses it. So I will link to all of those types of videos below. But it's really cool for that blend of what's needed, because it's easy, it's fast, and it makes the game much more alive, so to speak. So for me, like I mentioned, I take a blended approach. I use the theater of the mind for the social interaction and exploration tiers of the game, and I also use it for straightforward combat, though, without too many participants. I think it's not always necessary to break out the minis for an impromptu bar fight. When I say minis, by the way, you could use tokens or game pieces or Legos. It doesn't matter as long as you're representing things. That's a whole nother video. And I might break out the minis and do all that stuff for a bar fight. It just depends on how I'm feeling. But when I'm playing in person, I use a modified ultimate dungeon terrain approach, and I even take that approach and use it in the virtual tabletop. Same kind of idea, but you do it virtually. You don't need to build out the entire map unless you want to. You can just use the terrain pieces in the virtual tabletop for that particular scene. Again, the choice is totally up to you as a GM and the players when you're working together, and you can talk it through and figure out what you prefer. But if you're just getting started in the hobby, you should try out a few things and see what you like. It's always good to do a little research and to get input and watch videos on this stuff, but you have to play it. You have to see how it works for you in the table. You're going to figure out pretty quickly what works best for you and your group. So what's your preferred method? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll leave you with a little bit of related geek philosophy from Mark Twain. The theater of the mind is where the audience becomes the co-creator of the story. Cheers.